watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Friday evening doing our second show for the day. Pleased to say that we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Michael Egnor, who is the professor of neurosurgery and pediatrics at the State University of New York, Stony Brook, and has served as the director of pediatric neurosurgery. He's also an award-winning brain surgeon, and he is a contributor at Discovery Institute, and also has done quite a few debates from what I've seen. One of them was with Matt Dillahunty. I haven't seen the debate yet, but I'm looking forward to watching it. And really, really honored to have him on. Dr. Egnor, welcome to the show, and how are you?
Thank you, Mike. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, an honor to have you on. So what we're doing today is just kind of having a discussion on a kind of a wide variety of topics here. We have materialism, panpsychism, science and God. Does science prove the existence of God? All kinds of stuff. But we're going to start first with materialism. Let's start out basic when it comes to this. Please explain to us what exactly is materialism and who are some of the historic proponents of materialism?
Sure. Materialism is a metaphysical perspective that the only thing that exists is matter extended in space and the relations between matter. It's been around for a real long time. Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, a lot of ancient philosophers were materialists of one sort or another. And there are many modern materialists also. David Papineau, Paul and Patricia Churchland, Daniel Dennett, Francis Crick. There's many people have embraced materialism. Many materialists prefer the name physicalism, meaning that they believe that only things that can be described in terms of physics are real. And if you can't describe it in terms of physics, it's not real. And people typically describe three different kinds of materialism. One is reductive materialism, which is the view that everything that exists can be reduced to its basic atomic or subatomic elements, and there's nothing besides those elements. Non-reductive materialists believe that everything is material. However, not everything can be reduced to matter in such a crude way. They believe that there are properties of material things that are not reducible. And there are eliminative materialists. Eliminative materialism is championed by largely by Paul and Patricia Churchland, who are two philosophers. And they argue that in terms of the mind, that the mind is not material, that there is no mind at all. That is, that the only thing that actually exists is the brain. And that what we think of as the mind is just a misunderstanding. It's a poor use of words, and it's a mistaken concept. All we really are is brains. I really think that materialism is an indefensible philosophical perspective, and I don't even myself think of it so much as a philosophical theory as I do like it's really just a mistake. It's like saying 2 + 2 is 5 is mathematics. It's not really mathematics. It's just wrong. And materialism is self-refuting, particularly, for example, eliminative materialism. If you believe that there are no minds, that there's only brains, then you can't have an opinion about anything, including whether there are minds, because opinions aren't physical things. And an opinion is a proposition, and matter doesn't make propositions. So if you say there's no mind, then what are you arguing using? So it's materialism is kind of a nonsensical viewpoint.
So you would argue that it's not simply that maybe materialism is incompatible with Christianity, but more so that you can demonstrate it is not compatible with reason. And
it's not compatible, right? It's not compatible with reality. And something that's been pointed out by many philosophers, most prominently in my experience by Bruce Gordon, who's a wonderful philosopher of science associated with the Discovery Institute, is that when you look down at the atomic level, the most basic level of the natural world, matter disappears. That is that, as Werner Heisenberg said, atoms aren't things. They're not little balls. The electrons aren't little balls that circle around protons. At the atomic level, atoms and subatomic particles are equations. They're ideas. For example, when you hear about the mass of the electron, there's only one mass. That is that it's not as if the electron on the left side of the room has a little more mass than the one on the right side of the room. There is only one mass. All electrons are identical, completely identical in every respect. They can't be distinguished. They're ideas more than they are matter. So at the most basic level, matter doesn't even exist.
So, but wouldn't you be able to say that it's still tangible in some sense at the most basic level, or are you saying no? It's not really even tangible.
Well,
if it's tangible, you would say it's material, right?
Well, the thing is that matter, one has to first define matter. And it's notoriously difficult. Materialists are actually terrible at it. And there are as many different definitions of matter as there are materialists when they even venture to define it. Matter, the way we understand it today, generally is related to Descartes' definition of matter in the 17th century. And Descartes said that matter is just that which is extended in space.
Okay.
And res extensa was the term he used. And mind was res cogitans, thinking substance. But extension, so if you define matter as extension in space, how then could you explain the existence of abstract thought, which isn't extended in space? Justice isn't extended in space. Mathematics isn't extended in space. I mean, how long is the number 2 doesn't make any sense. So matter, so materialist understandings of things leave out enormous swaths of everyday life.
But an electron at the most basic level, is it extended in space?
Not really. In fact, it doesn't even at the most basic level necessarily have a location. That is that if you measure its location with infinite precision, then you know nothing about its momentum. For example, so as Heisenberg said in his uncertainty principle. So it's awfully difficult. You can't measure it precisely. It's intrinsic to the nature of an electron that its location is a probabilistic function.
And you're saying that that's an opening then to an immaterial dimension? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
That the whole concept of materialism begins to fall apart at the atomic level. Atoms are described by equations. They're not described by as much by dimensions or mass. They have mass, but even the mass itself is, for example, from the Higgs boson, is something that's described by an equation.
Which
atoms, I think idealism is a much more sensible metaphysical perspective than materialism is.
And of course, along with mathematics, you have the concept of logic, and so you would point to maybe logic as evidence that there are some things out there that are immaterial. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, logic is a very good example of how basic how the framework of thought cannot arise from matter, because the relationships between material things can be described in terms of physics. They can be described in terms of forces and numbers and probabilistic things and so on. However, the relationship between logical concepts cannot be described with anything resembling a force. To make a logical inference isn't an act of physics. It's an abstract act of logic.
Mhm.
So it's not clear how logic could come from anything material.
Mm.
How do you get modus ponens or modus
Right.
tollens out
Right.
of matter?
What? Would we be able to say that those things are just simply principles that we observe in nature, or would that not be sufficient?
Well, the process of observing them presupposes logic.
Mm.
That is that if you don't have logic, you can't make any sense of your observation. So
And I suppose, we also know that it would those principles of logic would be true even if we don't see every instance and every observation of it. We don't have to go throughout the world and test every single thing to make sure that these laws of logic work. We just know that they work.
correct,
Period.
correct.
Yeah.
In fact, the laws of logic can't be tested.
Hmm.
There's no experimental test that can show that if A then B, A therefore B, which is modus ponens. You can't test that. It's just true. And if you deny its truth, then you get into all kinds of problems with self-contradiction. So logic isn't even something that can be tested in nature. So there has to be something beyond the material world.
Is that why we end up finding things like the philosophy of science? Because you have to assume some of these things even in order to do science?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that the ancients actually had a very good definition of science. And of course, philosophers of science, one of the main projects in philosophy of science over the past couple of centuries has been to define science, to show what its boundaries are. And the ancient philosophers actually had a wonderful definition. Aristotle defined science as the systematic study of effects according to their causes. And natural science would then be the systematic study of effects in nature according to their causes, which is, I think, a very good definition of science. You
Sure.
systematically look at things and you try to figure out what caused them.
So your position would be characterized properly as dualism. Is that correct?
Yes. I dualism with a whole lot of respect for idealism.
Okay.
I think the idealist metaphysical perspective of the world is a very powerful idea and has a lot of truth to it. The reason I'm a dualist is a couple of things. One, I'm a tremendous admirer of Thomas Aquinas, who was a dualist of the mind, and I don't think that you can describe the mind. You certainly cannot adequately describe the mind on a scientific basis, let alone a conceptual basis, using materialism. But I think dualism falls a little. I'm sorry. I think idealism falls a little short also. I think that Thomistic dualism is the best way to describe the mind. And I really like Saint Augustine's viewpoint of the nature of reality. And Augustine said that reality is a thought in God's mind, and that we are thoughts in God's mind. And so that's an idealist way of looking at the universe and at reality. I add to that God is a Thomist. So what I think is that the idea that everything that exists, including us, are thoughts in God's mind, is a beautiful metaphysical perspective on reality, and I think it's true. And added to that, the structure of reality is beautifully described by Thomas Aquinas's metaphysics.
So tell me a little bit more from your perspective why the human mind can't be reduced to mere matter. I know we've touched a little bit on it so far, but maybe give me a few more reasons.
Well, I think the best insight in modern times, at least, to the nature of the mind was made by Franz Brentano, who was a German philosopher in the 19th century. And Brentano asked, in some ways, the fundamental question about the mind. He said, what is it that distinguishes a thought from a physical thing?
Mhm.
So if you have two things, one of them you'd say is mental, the other you'd say is physical, what basically is the difference between the two of them? And he
Mhm.
said there was one thing that every mental thing had that no physical thing had. And he said it was intentionality.
Okay.
And intentionality is the ability for a thought to be about something. Every thought has an object. When
Mhm.
you can't think about something without having something on the other end of the about. I can
Right.
think about I can think about God. I can think about the White House. I can think about food. I can think about my wife. But I can't think if there's no about there.
Right.
On the other hand, no material thing inherently is about anything. This pencil isn't
Mhm.
really about anything. I can ascribe aboutness to it by thinking about it. But if
Mhm.
I weren't in the room and they were just sitting there, it wouldn't be about anything. It's just a pencil.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
aboutness is the hallmark of the mind, and no material thing has any aboutness intrinsically. So the mind must transcend matter.
But it being an object distinct from you, wouldn't that by definition make it about, even if you're not thinking about it as an about, by it just being an object distinct from you, wouldn't it make it that?
No, no. A good example of that is, let us say that you were a pilot flying over a desert island, a deserted
Mhm.
island, and
Mhm.
you saw uh, uh, sticks on the beach that
Mhm.
were written out with the word help in
Okay.
them. And let's imagine two different scenarios. One of which is you saw that those sticks ended up that way because the wind and the waves had washed them up on shore and they happened to look like that. It was just coincidence. You would ascribe no aboutness whatsoever to that arrangement of sticks. You might think it was kind of funny, but you wouldn't land the plane and look for people.
Mhm. Mhm.
On the other hand, if you knew that the wind and waves could not have made the sticks like that, that would have aboutness. You'd say there's a person down there who put that together. That's the consequence of a mind.
Mhm.
So if you know in nature that a particular constellation of events was not put together by a mind,
Mhm.
then you can't really ascribe any aboutness to it. Doesn't make any
Mhm.
sense to say, well, what's that rock about?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, aboutness, intentionality isn't an inherent property of matter. We can ascribe aboutness to it. I can say that tree in my backyard reminds me of the time I used to play in the backyard with my kids.
Mhm.
That's kind of an aboutness.
Mhm.
But the tree itself isn't inherently about anything. It's my
Mhm.
mind that makes it about things.
Is there any scientific evidence that proves what you're saying and also disproves materialism?
The scientific evidence is massive, and
Mm.
it's overwhelming, and it's not widely recognized, and I'd be happy to go into that.
Mhm. Mhm.
The the first issue is the recognition that it's tricky and subtle to address metaphysical questions using science, but they can be addressed. I mean, metaphysics is about the nature of reality, and science is the organized study of reality. So you can address metaphysical questions if you ask them properly. And
Right.
I think there are three metaphysical questions that have been addressed very thoroughly by 20th and 21st century neuroscience. I'll use that. I'll stick mainly to neuroscience about the mind, that address the question as to whether the mind can be a material thing. The first question is the mind metaphysically simple? That
Mhm.
is, can the mind be divided?
Mhm.
Because matter, of course, can always be divided. If you have a
Mhm.
chunk of stuff, you can cut it down the middle and you get two chunks of stuff. And
Mhm.
can that be done to the mind uh, as it can be done to matter? If it can be done to the mind, then it would imply that the mind is in some sense material. If it can't be done to the mind, a reasonable inference would be that there's an aspect of the mind that's not material. The second question is the capacity for abstract thought, which Aristotle called the intellect, an immaterial power, or is it material? So is our ability to think abstractly tied completely to matter, or is there some aspect of our ability to think abstractly that is independent of matter? And the third question is free will real? Because if free will is real, then it is a power of the mind that is not determined by physical states, because we are certainly determined by physical states. I mean, I'm subject to gravity and electromagnetism and all those things. If free will is independent of those things, then free will is not a physical thing. In each of those questions has been addressed by a number of seminal scientific experiments in the 20th and 21st century. And I think clearly these experiments point to the fact that the mind is metaphysically simple. It cannot be divided, that the intellect is immaterial, and that free will is real. And I have evidence for that.
When it comes to the simplicity of the mind, though, if the mind is able to think, we now introduce potency. It's able to think, and then it thinks, act. It seems if you have potency and act, you already have a dualism to the mind. Is that not correct?
Yes. In fact, the potency and act being an Aristotelian kind of concept that Thomas Aquinas endorsed. The classical understanding of matter was very different from what we think of matter as. What Aristotle and St. Thomas thought matter was potency, was possibility, and so even our most basic concept of matter is kind of a modern thing that I think is deeply mistaken, actually.
So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. I'd be happy to either now or later on to go into the neuroscience that
go ahead.
These. Sure. The notion of metaphysical simplicity of the mind is a fascinating concept, and the concept is, can the human mind be split? And the most interesting research on this was done by a guy named Roger Sperry, who was a neuroscientist in the mid-20th century, who won the Nobel Prize for this work. Before Sperry worked, for several decades, a kind of operation on the brain had been developed to treat epilepsy. And it was called a corpus callosotomy, or commissurotomy was another name for it. And what the operation involved was it was done on people, and still is done on people. It's a relatively common procedure for people who have intractable seizures. There are people who will have 30 or 40 seizures a day. And what happens is that a little spark begins on one side of the brain, and then it transmits to the other side of the brain and causes a generalized seizure. And the transmission of this epileptiform focus is what causes these patients to suffer. And if you cut the fiber bundle between the hemispheres of the brain and prevent that signal from going across the brain, these people stop having these major seizures. They may have some occasional small seizures, but they're not the big seizures that are so difficult. And so corpus callosotomy was developed, and it was tried in animals first and developed in humans in the 1940s. And Roger Sperry in the 1960s realized that this is a wonderful opportunity in these people who had had the surgery. And the surgery worked fairly well. I mean, it's quite effective. And these people are fine after the surgery. I've done the surgery. I've known these patients for decades, and they're really fine. They're normal people after having their brains basically cut in half. Sperry realized that they are fascinating research subjects, so he got a number of these people to agree to be studied. And what he found was that there were perceptual splits. When you cut the brain in half, the visual fields, for example, are separated in some sense. For example, when the brain is cut in half, the right hand can respond to things that are seen in the right visual field, and the left hand can respond to things that are seen in the left visual field. But there's difficulty in getting some of the perceptual information across. One way of looking at it, the left hemisphere normally is the speech hemisphere. So if you present something in the visual field that the left hemisphere can see, the person who's had the corpus callosotomy can tell you what he's seeing. If you present it to the right hemisphere, he knows what he's seeing, but he can't say it. He can pick it out, he can point to it, but he can't say it. And for you and I, whose brains are connected, the information gets across easily, so it doesn't matter. But what Sperry also found, and he wrote a little bit about it, but more recent researchers have been looking at it in more detail, was that there was very much an aspect of the mind that could not be split. And basically what couldn't be split was the capacity, was self-awareness. That is, that these people are still one person. Their brains are cut in half, but they're one person. And the capacity for abstract thought. You don't split mathematical ability in half. You don't split philosophy in half. And there's been some very nice work along these lines done by a woman named Justine Sargent at McGill a couple of decades ago, and Yars Pinto, who's a neuroscientist who's still working. And they've described the split brain phenomenon as divided perception, but unified intellect or unified consciousness. That is, when you cut the brain in half, you cut some things in half, but not all of it. There's a unity that transcends the perceptual cut. And the best example of this unity was an ingenious experiment done by Justine Sargent, where she took people who had had brains cut in half, and she would present to each individual hemisphere a picture of either a vowel or a consonant. And the person would have to say whether there was a vowel or consonant being presented to them. And then she would ask them to indicate whether either hemisphere saw a vowel. And they were able to indicate whether either hemisphere saw the vowel with the other hemisphere, even though that other hemisphere was not connected. So they were able to use a disconnected hemisphere to indicate knowledge of something that cutting the brain in half had isolated that hemisphere from. That is, they could have knowledge that was not restricted to a physical hemisphere of the brain.
So could it just simply be that the idea of abstraction and determining that something is a vowel versus a consonant, could it be that that's just in both hemispheres of the brain?
No, because she would put the vowel she would present the vowel to what she did was very clever. It's kind of complex. She would put buttons in front of them in their left and right hand. The left hand in a split brain patient can only see the left visual field, can only respond to the left visual field. The right hand can only respond to the right visual field.
Right.
She would say, using either hand, when you see a vowel, push a button. When the left hemisphere saw a vowel, the right hand could push the button, even though the right hand had no neurological connection to the visual field that's in which the vowel was seen. Okay. So the right hand, in a sense, was blind to the fact that there was a vowel there, but the patient could use their right hand with no problem at all, easily, to indicate that they had seen a vowel. So what she concluded was that the ability to interpret abstractly what you were seeing was not tied to the physical hemispheres of the brain.
That's really interesting.
Yar Pinto found the same thing. And what they've done, because within the neuroscience community, a lot of neuroscientists are materialists, and there's an effort on the part of several neuroscientists like Yar Pinto to point out that Sperry's work in splitting the brain only split certain things. He split perceptual things, but he didn't split abstract thought. And that's been my experience. If you were to meet a person who had had split brain surgery, you couldn't detect it. They're perfectly normal people. And in fact, Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for his perceptual research. And you don't win a Nobel Prize for finding obvious things. meaning it's very subtle to find any splitting at all, despite the fact that their brains are split in half. So that certainly argues against materialism, and I think argues that certain powers of the mind, especially the intellect, are metaphysically simple. They can't be split with a knife, so they're not material.
But these powers are still dependent upon the brain?
Yes, they're dependent upon the brain ordinarily for normal function.
Okay.
But necessity is not the same thing as sufficiency.
Have any
that a brain is normally necessary for abstract intellectual thought, but it's not sufficient for it.
Have there been
immaterial?
Sorry,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Didn't mean to cut you off. Well, I was just going to say, have there been any materialist neurosurgeons who have come and offered counter arguments to what you're saying, and if so, what are they, and what's the weaknesses with them?
It's an interesting question. There have certainly been materialists. There haven't been any materialist neurosurgeons that I know of who've really gotten into these questions of philosophy.
Okay.
Well, actually, I'm sorry. There actually have been, and I take that back. There's a great neurosurgeon. He's not materialist. He started out as a materialist, Wilder Penfield, and we can talk about him in a bit. But there have been a number of philosophers and neuroscientists who have taken a materialist perspective on Roger Sperry, and they don't have any explanation for the work of Pinto and Surgeon. Well, I should point out that even Pinto and Surgeon looked, and I take that back slightly. They, being good scientists, they asked the question: could there be a hidden material explanation for this? And they proposed two possibilities. One is that they said, well, could it be that there's an incomplete cutting of the brain? That is, that there are still connections that can be made back and forth. Or could it be that there's some kind of external signaling? That is, and Sperry did find this, that when people would see something in one visual field, they would unconsciously signal themselves by tapping their own foot to tell them that there was something going on in that visual field. So the hemispheres could communicate physically through other ways. Pinto and Surgeon looked at both of these theories in detail and found that they weren't plausible. They videotaped the research subjects to show that they weren't signaling. And they measured the response time. If there was some roundabout way that the signal could get from one hemisphere to the other despite the cutting, the response times would be different depending on what hemisphere you sent it to. And down to the millisecond, the response times were identical. So there was no evidence that there was any circuitous route taken.
You know, just briefly, I say briefly, somewhat shifting gears here. Tell me a little bit, is there anything that you've studied about the human mind that you would say demonstrates intelligent design in a creator?
Well, I think everything about nature demonstrates intelligent design. I think intelligent design is everywhere. And I think the best argument for that is Thomas Aquinas's fifth way, which is the way from final cause. And Aquinas pointed out that when inanimate things in nature follow predictable patterns of behavior. Nowadays, we say when electrons obey the laws of quantum mechanics and rocks fall down towards the Earth, obeying Newtonian gravitation, you have to presuppose that they're guided by a mind, because there is a kind of foresight in the way inanimate things behave. They conform to laws of nature. They conform to certain predictable patterns. And that foresight implies a mind. So I think all of nature shows evidence for intelligent design. My own view of intelligent design is a little bit different from that of some other intelligent design advocates. Many intelligent design advocates see the evidence for intelligence in the complexity of things. And indeed, intelligent design can account for complexity. But I see more evidence of intelligence in the specification of things, in the teleology, and the tendency of natural processes to work towards ends, for acorns to become oak trees, for rocks to fall down and not up, for electrons to be attracted to protons instead of repulsed by them. So I'm, in my view, is more Aristotelian and Thomistic than most ID proponents. So I think ID proponents are quite right that nature is loaded with evidence for intelligent design, but I see the evidence more powerfully in teleology.
That makes sense. I also wanted to ask something that I kind of noticed that you had spoken about elsewhere, and I'm really curious to hear your answer to it, because I didn't get to hear the answer in the other videos. What is the difference between the human mind and an animal mind? Is there anything that really objectively says that, okay, this is different?
Oh yeah, sure. Animal minds and human minds are radically different. The best model for understanding both animal and human minds, I believe, is that of Aristotle, which St. Thomas sort of baptized and made into a Christian understanding of the mind. And what Aristotle said was that what makes something living is, well, I should go back to the very basics. Aristotle said that things that exist in nature can be described in two ways. They can be described as to what's intelligible about them, which he called form, and they can be described as what makes them individual, what makes them specific. Like, I can describe a tree, but from just my description of the tree, you wouldn't necessarily know which tree I was talking about. And what makes it individual is a principle of individuation. So Aristotle said that everything that exists in the world is a composite of a principle of intelligibility and a principle of individuation. The principle of intelligibility he called form, and the principle of individuation he called matter. And he took that form-matter concept, applied it to potency and act, which describes how change happens, and he made an entire metaphysical system out of form and matter. He said that what makes something living is that its form is a soul. That is, that the form of a living thing is its soul. And the soul has various powers depending on the kind of living thing that has it. Plants have what Aristotle called a vegetative soul. And a vegetative soul is powers of the organism that allow it to grow, that allow it to get nourishment, that allow it to carry on some kind of excretion, that sort of thing, basic physiological functions that plants have. Animals, Aristotle said, have sensitive souls. And by sensitive souls, he meant they have all the powers that plants have, meaning they can grow and take nourishment and things like that. But they also have sensation, they have perception, they have memory, they have emotions, they have locomotion, they have imagination. He said that human beings are the only animals that have a rational soul. And human beings, in addition to having the powers of the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul, so we have all the powers that plants and animals have, broadly speaking, we also have the capacity for abstract thought, to think about universal concepts without particular objects. And we have the capacity for free will, that we can freely choose. Our will is not determined. Those powers of the soul that human beings have uniquely, which is intellect and will, that is the capacity to reason and the capacity to choose freely, animals completely lack. Animals have no intellect at all. Animals have perception. They have imagination, they have memory, they have emotion, but they cannot think abstractly. A very good example of that is that my dog loves food of every sort. You put food in a bowl, she's very, very happy. She never thinks of nutrition. nutrition is not on her radar screen. It's, I think, a perfectly defensible statement that there has never been an experiment that has shown the existence of any capacity for abstract thought in any animal. Animals are not capable of contemplating universals. And a good example of why they can't contemplate universals is, imagine this. If you were going to contemplate nutrition, how could you contemplate it without language?
Mm-hmm.
How could you think of the nutritional content of food if you had no words?
Yeah.
And animals have no language. And so without language, you can't think abstractly, because thought always has an object, and it always has one of two kinds of objects. It either has a physical object or it has an abstract object. A physical object an animal can hold in his mind. He can think about the food. He can remember it. He can see it. He can smell it. He can taste it. But he can't remember or see or smell or taste nutrition, the concept of calories. Only human beings can do that. So the difference between the human and the animal mind is that human beings have intellects, and they're capable of thinking without physical objects of thought. They can think abstractly. Animals cannot think abstractly.
Yeah, I remember Mortimer Adler making that argument about,
Yes.
Abstraction and universals and language, especially when it comes to contrasting us with animals. And so my question then is, but haven't there been some experiments where they've had some kind of experiment with an ape where it seems that they understand language?
No.
Maybe am I misunderstanding?
Well, Adler, and you're quite right. Adler wrote beautifully on this topic, and it's important when one is talking about language to distinguish between signals and designators. What signs, first of all, taking a step back, signs are things that point to something else.
Right.
So broadly speaking, a signal is a sign that physically points to something else. A signal would be if I say, like, go there, I point. The pointing is a signal. And even a word can be a signal. That is that if you are in a crowded theater and you yell fire, that is a physical thing, in a sense, that people hearing that word respond in a purely physical way. They don't sit there and kind of abstractly think, well, what does he mean by fire? No, they just get up and run.
Right.
So a sound, even a word sound, can be a signal. A designator is a sign that has nothing physical to do with that which it designates. A good example is cat, the word cat. The word cat has nothing to do with a cat.
Right.
It doesn't look like a cat. Doesn't sound like a cat. Meow might sound like a cat. A cat doesn't. Right. And this disconnection between designators and their objects is very different from the connection between signals and their objects. Animals can only use signals. They can't use designators. Now, you can train an animal to associate a designator with an object.
Okay.
I tell you, when I go up to my little dog and say, "Do you want a cookie?" and I say "cookie" really loud, my dog goes nuts.
Right.
But for her, cookie is a signal. It's not a word. It's a sound that she connects by memory with the things she likes to eat. There's no grammar there. There's no syntax. And as Chomsky has pointed out, animals don't do grammar. Animals don't do syntax. So you can train an animal to do all kinds of things. You can train an animal to do what looks like mathematics. I mean, if you give me a pigeon, I can train that pigeon to, when I ask him what is 1 + 1, he'll tap with his beak twice. I can train him to do that. And all I have to do is reward him when he responds that way.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that he knows anything about adding 1 + 1. It just means he's been trained he gets a cookie if he does a certain thing.
Yeah.
So in situations where apes appear to have language, they're really just trained to react to signals that are words. So you can say sad, and the ape may associate sadness with an emotion the animal is feeling, but it doesn't mean that he understands the word. He's just reacting to a signal. So
I want to ask, I want to ask one more question about the mind, and then we're going to talk about panpsychism. So, this is actually a pretty popular question these days. Could a machine ever think?
No.
Is it possible that we could ever create a machine that could think or be self-aware? If not, why not?
The reason we cannot create a machine why it's impossible to create a thinking machine gets back to the concept of essentialism. And essentialism is a metaphysical perspective that was endorsed by many of the classical philosophers, and I think is very much a part of Thomistic philosophy, that things in the world have essential natures that you can't, pardon the expression, screw with. That is, that things are what they are, and you can't just transform anything into anything else. And only things that have souls can think. And particularly, the only things that can think, as far as we know, are things that have sensitive souls, which are animals, and rational souls, which are people. Things that just have forms, like my coffee cup or a rock. Thought is simply not one of the powers they have. The reason that machines can't think, when people think of machines thinking, they usually think of computers. And there's a very simple way of understanding why a computer can't think. And that is that computers work by algorithmic processes. That is, that computers match an input to an output according to a set of rules. And the matching of the input to the output according to a set of rules is independent of meaning. And that's a very important concept. Imagine a word processor that you're using to type an essay. And the essay, say, is the yay viewpoint of a particular debate. So you type out this nice essay. You can then type the nay viewpoint of that debate on the same word processor, and the word processor works in exactly the same way. The word processor does not care about the meaning of the essay you're typing. And in fact, that's what makes it a useful word processor. It would be a very bad word processor if it could only be used for one meaning.
Right.
What makes computation so enormously useful is that it's blind to meaning. It has no meaning at all. That's why you can put any meaning you want into it. That's why you can take a photograph of any scene with your digital camera. Your digital cameras don't come with, this camera only takes happy scene pictures, and this camera takes sad scene pictures. Anything. So thought always has meaning. It's always intentional, as Franz Brentano said. Computation never has meaning. That's what characterizes computation, is that it's free of meaning, so it's useful to us. So not only can't a computer think, but computation is the antithesis of thought. It's the opposite of what thought is. And anything in a computer that looks like thought, like if you play chess against a chess machine, you're not playing against a machine. You're playing against the chess masters whose programs were programmed into the machine. The machine, just the same as when you are enjoying a Shakespearean play by reading a book. The book isn't telling you about the play. Shakespeare is telling you the play using the book as an instrument. Computers are merely instruments. They don't think. There are all kinds of instruments of thought. The air vibrating right now from my voice is an instrument of telling you what I'm thinking. You can program your thoughts into a book or on a piece of paper by writing them. You can program them into a computer. But the air or the book or the computer are not capable of thought. Only people are capable of thought.
Now, tell me a little bit about panpsychism. What exactly is it, and why is it problematic?
Well, panpsychism is a viewpoint that it's an attempt to solve the mind-body problem. It's widely recognized among, I'd say, many philosophers of mind, that materialist efforts to understand the mind are failing. That you really can't understand mental processes by simply considering physical things. So that's a problem. There's kind of an allergy among a lot of philosophers to a dualist or idealist way of looking at nature. So one idea that has come up that is currently being advocated by Philip Goff, who's a prominent philosopher, although there are many other philosophers who have suggested this, is that mind is a fundamental constituent of everything that exists. That there's a little bit of mind in electrons, there's a little bit of mind in protons, maybe there's more mind in mud and more mind in a tree, and even more mind in an animal, and a lot of mind in people. But mind is everywhere. So everything, in some sense, has at least a little piece of mind. And it sounds kind of crazy. I mean, electrons are conscious. It's an odd way of looking at things. And panpsychists generally would say that electrons aren't conscious in the same way that we're conscious, but there's something like consciousness in them. And I have respect for that. I'm not a panpsychist. I think panpsychism is wrong. But what panpsychists are seeing is that there is a purposefulness, a teleology, kind of an intentionality that permeates the natural world. And they're trying to make sense of it, and I don't think they have the language to make sense of it. There is intelligence in matter, but the intelligence doesn't come from the matter. It comes from the creator of the matter.
That makes sense.
So panpsychism is a glimmer of truth, but there's a deeper truth that the panpsychists are missing.
Huh. So is this because they see certain laws of physics in the natural world, and they think that that's evidence of, and that's their best way to explain teleology? Is that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I don't know that they've used the laws of physics in quite that way.
Okay.
But it does convey, if you think about it, I mean, you can kind of a childish way of looking at it, but it's a good question. How does an apple know to fall down instead of up?
Yeah, right.
You know, and that gets back to Thomas Aquinas's fifth way, that there's a directedness in nature that presupposes a mind. The panpsychist would say the mind is in the matter. And, of course, St. Thomas would say the mind is in the creator, and he imparts it to the matter.
And so the panpsychist is kind of picking up on those tendencies in the matter, but ascribing it to matter because they don't have in their worldview that there would be a creator.
Precisely. Yeah. But I have a lot of respect for panpsychism, because I think the panpsychists are tackling a very real issue, and they're actually trying to answer it, whereas materialists simply deny it. They just pretend it doesn't exist. The panpsychists say, mind is a fundamentally real thing. It's not reducible to matter. And the best they can do with it is to say that everything has a mind.
And let me ask one more question before we get to some chat questions, and y'all go ahead and start sending them. Make sure to send them to @ReasonandTheology. One more. I know I asked you already, does the mind prove the existence of God somehow, but or intelligent design rather? What would you say are some of the things that you see in science in general that point to God's existence beyond what we've already spoken about when it comes to teleology and things like that? Is there anything else?
Well, it's a common argument made by atheists that science can't prove the existence of God, and sometimes it's even made by theists. Theists will say, well, I have faith, I believe, but science can't prove God's existence. I point out that there's an entire discipline of theology called natural theology, which uses evidence in nature to prove God's existence. All of these proofs, and I can think of 10 of them off the top of my head that are very strong proofs of God's existence. All of them have the same logical structure as scientific theories. All of Aquinas's five ways are scientific theories. For example, Aquinas argued in his first way that the evidence for change in nature has to be carried back to a prime mover. That is, that you can't have change occurring in the natural world without an unmoved mover, which he said is what all men call God. The reasoning that he used for that was based on the evidence that change exists, a logical structure to understand what change means, and an inference to best explanation. That's just inductive reasoning and has exactly the same structure as any scientific theory. So I believe that all of Aquinas's arguments for the existence of God, as well as St. Augustine's argument, which was that the existence of universals proves God's existence, the Neoplatonic argument that the overall organization of the natural world proves God's existence. All of these different proofs of God's existence that have been proposed through the ages are actually scientific arguments. They take evidence from nature, put them together in a logical structure, and make the best inference they can. So I think God's existence is, from a scientific perspective, by far the most thoroughly proven theory in science. God's existence is a scientific theory, and science proves it because, as St. Thomas would say, every instance of change in nature, every time an atom does anything, everything proves God's existence. Every cause in nature proves God's existence. Everything that necessarily exists proves God's existence. Every degree of perfection proves God. So the evidence for God's existence is a scientific question, and it is the most thoroughly proven theory in modern science. Of course, atheist scientists would disagree, but they'd be wrong.
Marcher asked this, and by the way, thank you for the super chat. Intentionality in classical logic. There is the notion of signs in signatum, such as smoke signifying fire. Don't natural signs exhibit aboutness?
Yes. Aboutness is the way I think is a good way to look at it, and many philosophers have taken this view, is that intentionality in the human mind, the capacity for the human mind to be about something, is just a reflection of the teleology in nature. That is, that teleology is intentionality writ large. So my capacity to direct a thought at something is quite analogous to the capacity of things in the natural world to be directed to ends, to natural processes to go to natural ends, which of course very strongly implies that there is a mind behind nature, a mind that at least my mind is at least a little reflection of the great mind that is behind nature. Essentially, that my mind is created in the image of the mind that created the universe.
David the Hermit asks, if the mind controls the brain and the brain controls the body, where does that leave the soul?
One has to be very careful of thinking of mind-body relationships in like one would think of a computer, this controlling that. The soul is the organization, the intelligible principle of a living thing. The soul isn't a little control room sitting in the brain, pushing buttons and making things happen. There's a very good way of understanding the soul that really clarifies it. If you think of a person, say a person dies suddenly, they're walking along and they drop dead. Everything that was true of that person a second before they died, minus everything that is true of that person a second after they're dead is the soul.
Hmm.
The soul is what makes a body alive,
Mhm.
and that's it. So it's a set of principles, a set of powers, a set of abilities. It's not magical. It's not a wispy, smoky thing that happens to fill your body. It's not a control panel with buttons. It is what the body is capable of doing alive that is not capable of doing dead. That's what the soul is.
Is Cartesian thought useful to this discussion of mind? How can a mind be an object?
I'm a kind of an anti-Cartesian. I have a lot of good philosopher friends who have a lot of sympathy for Descartes, and I think they have good reasons, meaning Descartes had some profound insights. But I think the Cartesian metaphysical perspective was profoundly wrong. That is, that what Descartes did is he said that human beings are two separate substances that are linked together. There's a thinking substance and there's a material substance. And that basically we are meat machines. And that our soul runs the meat machine. And that's pretty bad metaphysics. I mean, it really is a major departure from Thomistic and Aristotelian metaphysics. And the problem is that by separating reality into thinking substances and material substances, he gave modern day materialists a platform by which they could just get rid of the thinking substance and just focus on the material substance. So the mind doesn't control the body. That's not, it's not a matter of the mind being a driver of the body. The mind is several powers of the soul. And the soul is simply that which makes the body a living thing. So,
James interviews asks, what does Dr. Egnor think of Charles Van Doren's view in his book, A Brief History of Knowledge, where he talks about in the future robots and AI will take over the world?
Well, it's a very, very important point. And I think it could be a point that will determine whether or not our civilization survives. There is no question that AI is already having a profound influence on our lives and will continue to have even more influence in the future. And it could save us or destroy us or do both. But we misunderstand AI. AI is us. That is that machines have no intelligence whatsoever. And AI is artificial intelligence, meaning there is no real intelligence in a machine. All of the behavior of machines that seem intelligent is from the human beings who program them, who make them, who design them, and who use them. So all of the intelligence in AI is our intelligence. There is no intelligence except for that. The problem is that people who use AI and make AI often don't understand that. So I think an enormous challenge that we face as human beings, because AI is coming, AI is here, and it's going to be even more powerful, is to understand what AI does to us. How do we make it? How do our thoughts get transmitted through machines? And because AI is an extremely powerful thing, it's an extremely dangerous thing, but there is no intelligence in AI except our intelligence. But we don't understand how our intelligence is leveraged in AI very well, and we need to study that.
Alexander asks, what are your thoughts on immaterial memory? How is it stored in your estimation?
Using the concept of memory in the Aristotelian, and memory has been the subject of some debate among philosophers of mind, even classical philosophers of mind. But I think one has to distinguish between memory and knowledge. Memory is to recall an image or a perception. So I can remember my grandmother's face because I can remember in my mind the image of her face. But I don't remember the square root of 2. The square root of 2 is something that I know. Now I can call that knowledge to my immediate awareness, but to know something in that sense is to have an abstract knowledge, and that's an immaterial thing. Memory is a purely material power of the mind. Animals have memory, and I forgot the rest of the question. I'm sorry.
Well, he was asking, how is it stored in your estimation?
Well, there's a very good argument made by Bennett and Hacker. Bennett is a neuroscientist from Australia, and PMS Hacker is a philosopher from Oxford, that it makes no sense to talk about the storage of memory. The reason is that memories are not the kinds of things that can be stored. Memories are retained perceptions. They're perceptions or images that you retain, and you can store physical objects, but memories aren't physical objects. For example, I can't store the memory of my grandmother's face. I can have a region of my brain or a particular configuration of molecules that are necessary for me remembering my grandmother's face. That's certainly true. But that doesn't mean that my memory of her face is stored. I can't store a memory in my brain any more than I can store it in my pocket. Memories aren't storable. Memories are psychological phenomena that you have. They're not things that you can collect and put in places. So it doesn't even make any sense to say you can store a memory.
But that aspect you would say is immaterial, correct?
Because
here's
very subtle.
Yeah.
The memories are not inherently immaterial, whereas intellectual concepts are inherently immaterial. Memories are not inherently immaterial. It's just that it makes no sense to say that you can store them.
Okay. And the reason why I ask is, does that mean a disembodied spirit or an angel who is just simply a spirit without a body, does it have the ability to have a memory?
It has knowledge. And I think this, St. Thomas wrote about the psyche of angels at some length. And immaterial spirits have enormous capacity for knowledge because they're not limited by our clunky human need to use matter to help us see things and hear things. But so if you mean by memory, if you mean deep, profound knowledge, yes, without question, immaterial beings, angels are immeasurably more intelligent than we are, and God, of course, is immeasurably more intelligent than anything. But what an immaterial being would know would not be the same thing we mean by memory.
Okay.
It is what we mean by memory is a retained image or retained perception, and they don't have images or perceptions because they don't have eyes and so on. But they have knowledge, and the knowledge far transcends anything we're capable of.
I guess what I mean by memory is recalling a past event, a knowledge of a past event.
Well, it depends. When you say you recall a past event, do you recall the picture of it, or do you recall your understanding of it?
I see. Okay. So they would be able to, I guess an angel, would they be able to recall the understanding of it?
Well, yes. They would have the understanding. They wouldn't even have to recall it. They just understand it. But they couldn't recall the picture of it because they never had a picture.
That makes sense. I see.
Because they don't have eyes.
That makes sense. Right. Okay. Here's one, B1000. What are Dr. Egnor's current thoughts on the Libet experiment? I remember seeing him talk about it a while ago, i.e., what does it prove regarding substance dualism, etc.?
Sure. Benjamin Libet was a neuroscientist in the mid-20th century who studied many things. He was a brilliant experimenter. And his most famous experiments were on free will. And just briefly, what Libet did was he asked people to sit at a desk with a button in front of them and to decide to push the button anytime they felt like it. So just sit there and push the button whenever you feel like it. He put a clock in front of them that was ingeniously designed so that when they made the decision to push the button, they could look at the clock and tell exactly what time they made that decision, and then they push the button. And he wanted to find out what was happening in their brain the moment they made the decision and the moment they pushed the button. And what he found was there was a consistent pattern. If you push the button at time 0, you would have the intention, the decision to push the button at approximately 300 milliseconds before time 0. And there would be a spike of brain activity a couple hundred milliseconds before your decision to push the button, and even more milliseconds before actually pushing the button. So he found that the awareness that you make a decision wasn't the first thing in the decision chain. The first thing was a brain spike that you were unaware of. And so many people interpreted that experiment as showing that we didn't have free will, because our brain was spiking away, the laws of physics, physiology, all that stuff was happening. And then we think we decided to push the button, but we didn't really decide freely. Our brain made us do it, and we were mistaken to think we pushed it. So Leibniz didn't accept that interpretation, and he extended the experiment in a brilliant way. He asked some of his volunteers, when you decide to push the button, immediately veto that decision. So decide to push the button, record the time you decide, but don't push it, veto it. And what he found was that there was no electrical activity associated with the veto, meaning you would have the spike, but then you go along, you would make the decision to push the button, then you would decide not to, and that was silent electrically. Your brain did nothing when you decided not to. So he said that the temptation to push the button was physical. But the decision to push the button, the veto, no veto, was not physical. So he said he didn't prove free will, but he proved free won't. He proved that basically our brain presents us with what he interpreted as temptations. And we have the free choice to push the button or not, to accept the temptation or not. And he pointed out, he said, it's amazing how close his science was to the traditional Christian and Jewish view of temptation and sin, that we can't stop the temptation, but we don't have to comply. So he felt he proved free will, and I think his research strongly supports the viewpoint that free will is real.
One more here from Mihoville, and thank you for the super chat. Can Dr. Egnor comment on the following thing I found during my research? If brain tissue is kept in specific environment, even if the person or animal died, we can see that majority of cells are alive per exam, and then it cuts off, and I guess he's typing the rest, but I don't see it yet.
My guess would be he's asking is what is the ontological status of brain tissue if it's alive but separated from a human being. It is it's a profound question. And the simple answer is I have no simple answer. I don't know, and I if that was the question asked, I don't have a good answer for it. It's a very, very difficult question.
Yeah, and I don't see any continuation to it, so we'll assume that was the case. Dr. Egnor, thank you so much for coming on. I really value your time and appreciate you coming on and doing this. This is fascinating interview.
I thank you. It's been a real privilege, Mike. Thank you.
Please put in a plug for anything that you're working on or want to make the viewers and listeners aware of.
My main plug is for the Discovery Institute and the Bradley Center. They're both wonderful organizations that are studying intelligent design in nature, which is ubiquitous, And they're also the Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence is studying the human mind from a perspective that's not restricted to materialism. So they're studying it in a way that respects the real viewpoint, that there are aspects of the mind that are not material, and respects human dignity. These are wonderful organizations, and they're wonderful organizations to support.
Perfect. I hope to have you again on in the future, and maybe bring a debate partner who will, challenge you on some of your assertions, and you can challenge them. I think that'd be really fun.
I would love to do that. And I should point out that there's a ton of science that we didn't get to. So anytime you'd like to talk about that, it's good stuff. So thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much for coming on. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what we're doing here. Until next time, God bless you all.